so much for being here today. I'm Chinasa Okolo, a fellow at the Brookings institution, and we're going to start off with 5-minute presentations from each of our panelists. And the first presentation will be from Justin Arenstein.
Cool. That was a quick jump in. So hi, my name is Justin. I'm the Chief Strategist and CEO at a non-profit called Code for Africa. It's a civic tech data liberation organization. We work across 26 African countries, and we've been going for about 12 years. So the world that we work in is going to color everything that I say during kind of my talk today. And to give you a little bit of a feel, of those 26 countries, 7 of them are ruled by a military junta that came to power in coups in the last 2 years. Two of those countries are involved in major wars, so Sudan and the DRC. The DRC one gets even less publicity than kind of the DRC, than Sudan. And then a number of the other countries are ruled by very authoritarian governments, whether it's Rwanda or kind of Ethiopia and elsewhere. And so being invited to speak on policy and the kind of the need for stronger regulation leaves me a little bit ambivalent. I mean, the last thing we want to do is give predators even more efficient weapons for clamping down on the folk that we work with. So what I do want to do is just kind of highlight 3 issues that we do when we approach working with AI and Gen AI with our partners, and hopefully spark a little bit of kind of broadening the thinking or thinking a little bit out of the box to how we approach regulation of these technologies in the minority world. So first, ironically, and potentially a little bit counterintuitively, with the partners we work with, we very quickly come to realize that the fact that the LLMs and the large open, the large Gen AI companies, the fact that they haven't hoovered up our data and they haven't trained our models on it is not necessarily a bad thing. That this lag in Africa is giving us a little bit of an opportunity to figure out where we want to put walls in place. And so we're working with partners where it's public interest media, kind of traditional knowledge digitization networks, and we're helping them deploy robot TXTs to guard against AI crawlers and scrapers. That's just one example. So that they can start deciding what public good information gets hoovered up and turned into a commercial product in the north, and what they could really sit down and have a real conversation with technology platforms about to create a more equitable kind of a forward-looking partnership. In addition to that, we also are often faced by the challenge that the conversation around AI down in sub-Saharan Africa, at least, is often theoretical. We're being asked to make policies and put in place kind of guardrails to ensure that we minimize harm, when most of the people doing this are not engineers. They don't have access to engineers. They've never even had the chance to tinker or play around on any of the technologies that we're talking about. And the result is an often inappropriate copy and paste of solutions and policies from up north that have no application in the world that we work in. And so there's a big need to create shared infrastructure, public infrastructure, so that we can really deploy and understand what the opportunities, but also what the real world risks are in our world. You've heard from various speakers this morning about India and Africa is no different, being littered by AI startups and pilots in agriculture, health, and so forth. We need to get beyond the small little quick fix, very high profile pilots and start building infrastructure that is shared. And here there are lessons from the previous things that helped us leapfrog. For example, mobile and telecom networks. We don't need to learn from all the bad stuff. But one of the things they were forced to do in Africa that we haven't seen in North America, for example, was that they had to build shared backbone infrastructure to roll out there, so the signal towers, to roll out mobile connectivity even into rural communities. And we need a similar ethos when we're talking now about kind of AI technology. And then thirdly, we also, and just before that, we also need to very strongly look at creating meaningful access to compute power. So at the moment, Azure, for example, says, we're helping you. We've got a nonprofit scheme. You get $2,000 a year. You can do nothing with that. We need to be realistic and get beyond the window dressing. In terms of talent, there is talent. It needs to be recruited. It needs to be offered resources on a greater kind of global stage. But there needs to be a corresponding investment back into the ecosystem that produced that kind of talent. And so that we need to be investing back into the next generation of talent who are going to be sucked out by the large tech platforms. And we're not seeing that done at scale yet. And in the final piece, I was asked to talk about information tech integrity, because that's where a lot of our work sits. We're already seeing, as I think various speakers have said, we're already seeing AI in the field, especially around the weaponization of language. All of these countries and their conflicts that I mentioned have been pushed into violent war through weaponized hate speech, conspiracist theories, and so forth. We're already seeing it happening at scale. But what we need to do is, I think, take a step back about how we think about mis and disinfo. It is not a public literacy issue. That's victim shaming. We're making it the responsibility of the people who are being targeted by mis and disinfo. If you look at what really drives mis and disinfo, it's a large shadow economy of people who work very deliberately to build digital infrastructure, recruit audiences, get those audiences simmering and bubbling with outrage and anger and kind of literally hate. And then they trigger them when someone steps in. They say, we need a ready-made audience for whatever our campaign is. They do this in the shadows. It's covert. They do it through, it's covert meaning you just don't see it happening. So it's happening in the dark web. They do it through lying and misleading the audiences that they're recruiting. And so what we should be doing is treating mis and disinfo for what it is. It's an organized crime enterprise. And the way that you tackle organized crime is very different from the way that you tackle a literacy issue. We should be following the money. We should be demonetizing the kind of the enrichment profiteering networks, and we should be deplatforming the infrastructure. And that needs to bleed into the policy that we're making, because Gen AI is nuclear when it comes to be able to disseminate weaponized content in SMS format. Video and audio is the stuff that everyone talks about, and that's easy to detect. When you're talking about 250 to 300 characters on a text message as back and forth live communication on someone on WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram, it's undetectable that you're speaking to a bot. And that's what we're seeing at massive level across the continent. So those three things, final thought. The interfaces that people use to engage with AI are going to change dramatically. They're not what we are creating policy for at the moment. I'm on an FT strategies kind of group that just looks at Gen Z kind of approaches. I've got a young 12-year-old and a 4-year-old. The way they engage with information is through Twitch. TikTok is for old people and dinosaurs. It's through Twitch. And if there's one thing you go and have a look at on Twitch, look up AI Jesus. It's not religious at all. And just to see how people engage and consume information through a bot that they create a deep relationship with. It'll change the way that you think about what we should be regulating for.
Great. Yeah, so thank you, Justin. And so next we'll have a 5-minute talk from Barbara Glover, who is a program officer for the African Union High-Level Panel on Emerging Technologies, African Union Development Agency-NEPAD.
Thank you, Chinasa. So I think what I would want to share today is more about our experiences working with African policymakers, maybe to contribute to the global discourse. So within the AI space, I started working on policymaking around AI early 2022. This was based on recommendations from the African Union High-Level Panel on Emerging Technologies on the need to have continental strategies around AI. One of my first shockers was how much capacity needs to be built when it comes to African policymakers in the field of AI, in the sense that our early engagements, most of the feedback we got was, oh, AI is about to take away jobs. I'm a politician. I have 4 years to campaign to be voted again. I'm not going to push a technology that will take away jobs, because then I wouldn't get votes the second time. And then moving to discussions like AI is just robotics coming to take over the world, and we wouldn't be able to control it. What we've observed is the fact that then there is no attention paid to regulations at all, because you do not want to, they don't want to get engaged in something they do not understand. And so one of the first things we started doing was building capacity at that level, addressing myths and misconceptions around artificial intelligence, and just getting our policymakers to talk about it. Another unique thing we observed was the fact that because a majority of policy and decision makers on the continent are what we call BBC born before computers, there's very little knowledge about IT. And so in this policy space, there's now the need to bring in young people into the policy development space, which is what I loved from the earlier remarks by the ambassador. We've identified that for the first time, we've had active younger people coming into the policy and decision making space around artificial intelligence, because there isn't that knowledge that exists currently. And it's something that we are utilizing for getting the youth more involved in the international development space. Another thing that we have noticed is the ownership of AI. For instance, even at the African Union level, we've had conflicts with which units should take lead in the AI discussion. Should it be IT? Should it be science and technology? Should it be the data unit? And there's that kind of conflicts. Everyone is trying to take the lead, and there isn't yet that level of collaboration that is desired to be able to meet some of these recommendations in our strategies. And so what we are doing now at this level is to sort of argue for the fact that AI isn't like every other technology. There is a need for more effective collaboration at the various levels, and with the various ministries and sectors coming together to be able to effectively roll out strategies and recommendations around artificial intelligence on the continent. Maybe one more point I could add is the fact that we also understand that Africa has its unique challenges, and AI might not be a priority for most people at present. We have other basic challenges. We have health challenges. We have low literacy levels. We have major issues that perhaps will not need a prioritization of artificial intelligence, as beautiful as it sounds. And so when we make recommendations or we engage our stakeholders, we are cognizant of the fact that there are other pressing issues that need attention. We have a program called the Program for Infrastructure Development for Africa. And what we identified is ICT penetration on the continent is currently at 25%. Electricity access is currently at 44%. So we have other pertinent issues that we want to address before prioritizing artificial intelligence as, the savior of the world kind of messaging. And that's one thing that we are learning in our policy and decision making and in recommendations to our policymakers, to not be blindsided to the existing situations on ground presently. I hope with the 5-minute talk, I've given you a fair idea of some of our experiences in policymaking, and looking forward to answering more questions. Thank you.
That was great, Barbara. Thank you. And so next we have Vukosi Marivate, the UP ABSA Chair of Data Science at the University of Pretoria.
Okay, thank you. Presentation go on. Everybody's up? Oh, okay, I see the presentations. Okay, cool, thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. I'm at the University of Pretoria, run the Data Science for Social Impact Research Lab. So I'm in the computer science department. More working, 70% of the lab works on natural language processing in African languages. And then the other 30% is on data science and society. So how we get these things into other people's hands. What I wanted to really illustrate, and I wanted to use pictures on this, is really some of the work that's happened over the last decade across the continent and how it gets us to some of the conversations that we're having here. So one was in identifying that we don't have enough people. This is back in 2016 to really drive a active continent that can actually have agency, we started the Deep Learning Indaba, which is the annual gathering now of AI across the continent. And we wanted to strengthen African machine learning by making sure that Africans become critical contributors, owners, and shapers of, at that time, what we call the coming revolution, like, in machine learning. So this was our first meeting in Wits University, my alma mater, where we had 330 people in attendance out of 700 applications to come. I'll just skip 2 years at a time. This was us in Nairobi, 650 people attending, almost 1,800 applications. And this was us last year in Ghana and Accra, 800 attending, 3,000 applications in the post-ChatGPT world. The other thing is that having 36 different African countries represented 800 attendees, 45% of them being women, means that this is a very different kind of AI conference. So when you go to, and we have about 200 travel grants. We have, this year, we're going to Senegal in the first 7th September. So I'm expecting that we're going to be over 1,000 people at this area. The other one is thinking about language. One continent, 54 countries, 2,000 plus languages across the continent. We started Masakani in 2019 as a spin-off, actually, at the Indaba itself. To have Masakani means building together. How do we change the state of African languages when it comes to natural language processing? And in this case, we created a grassroots, distributed research foundation. At that first Deep Learning Indaba in 2019, at the workshop, we worked to really think about how we're going to shape this. And this has created a community inside the natural language processing community globally that has gotten Africans to really see themselves within these spaces, as opposed to being that you're outside trying to do something, but you can find yourself. People are working on languages, building up new infrastructures in all ways. It's not just the technical. And then finding ways to even work on languages wherever they are, African languages wherever they are in the world. And ICLR last year, the most prestigious AI conference in the world, I would argue, it happened in Kigali, in Rwanda, for the first time on the African continent. And the biggest workshop there ended up being the African Natural Language Processing Workshop in this space. The first paper that we had out of the Masakani Research Foundation was this paper, the participatory research paper, and it ended up winning the first Wikimedia Research Award for democratizing the internet from Jimmy Wales, the founder of Wikipedia. Since then, I would argue that Masakani is the most prolific AI lab on the whole African continent. It has really gone on to really bring up lots and lots of scholarship around language, about us, how we see ourselves, not just from the technical perspective, but also the socio-technical and the social side of what's actually going on with African languages within the AI space. Last year, we also won the Ars Technica Digital Humanity Award as well, and we ran up with another award during that period, during the time. One thing to notice is that grassroots AI has been something that's been very prolific within AI in itself, in that is also a reaction from just having the people with the power at the top. There's also lots of organizations at the bottom who are trying to get people around. So Deep Learning Indaba is there, Data Science Africa, Masakani, but then now you see the impact of, for example, America's NLP. You have Kiito in Latin America, which is built up as a Indaba-like gathering, but now for South America. So how do we move the needle? Barbara said a bit about this, the policy, the slow. So you can have the revolution on one side, but you also have to deal with building up policy. And it was great to work with lots of other grassroots organizations, to work with the AUDA and NEPAD in building up the policy side, and then releasing the white paper by AUDA this year and the roadmap. The other one is that we need to think about a demographic dividend. If in 2050, 1 in 4 people on this globe is going to be African, and 1 in every 3 children being born at that time is going to be African, we have to plan for a very different kind of future. So for us, we also understand what got you here is not going to get us there. I'll finish off. We built up all this stuff for community, formalization, seniority, opportunities, but mobility is still a challenge. Moving around the African continent is hard. It's very expensive as well, and you still have to deal with visas. Absorbing the funding available. Unfortunately, there's a lot of international funding, but I do not believe that the African continent can actually absorb it in its entirety. So we need lots of changes in administration and making sure that people can actually get this work, building up more opportunities for students and professionals on the continent, developing and supporting research and faculty, blazing our own path, choosing what directions we want to take, and there must be more local R&D investments. Just as an example, the US is about close to 4% of GDP is used for R&D. In South Africa, we were at 0.6%. We used to be at 0.8% before COVID, but the private sector has taken out money. And as soon as you leave South Africa, that number very quickly goes to zero. So that takes you into a very different kind of environment of how you can shape your future. We have to build up startups. The other thing, like, for example, that I do, I spend my 1 day a week. I'm a co-founder of an AI startup called Llama AI, and there's a number of AI startups now that have started across the continent, especially being built by researchers who came also from the academy. So finding ways to experiment our way forward. So takeaway, African AI has always been there. We need to figure out a way to experiment forward. It has to be in a collaborative environment. We're not going to have universities that have 500 faculty in computer science. That's not the thing that's going to happen, but there has to be other ways that we think about this. And there must be more local private investments for R&D to move us into that. So
great. Thank you so much, Vukosi. All right. And so next we'll have a presentation from Kiito Shilongo, a Senior Tech Policy Fellow at Mozilla.
Thank you. We'll just start with maybe giving a clap for Vukossi's amazing presentation, maybe. Thank you. Well, I'm Kiito Shilongo. I'm a Senior Tech Policy Fellow at the Mozilla Foundation, and I'll just begin by sharing the work that Mozilla does and the approach that Mozilla takes, particularly with the African programs that I'm a part of for the African team. First of all, Mozilla in 2020, as some of you might know, had drafted a white paper on trustworthy AI. Through that, we have defined trustworthy AI, which is building and deploying technology which enables like agency for people, but also holds big corporations accountable for any harm that they may choose or their actions. And in light of that, not only for the benefit of individuals, but also collectives, so groups. And in that, in that white paper, they outlined 4 key areas, which is firstly, changing AI development norms. So the kind of norms and values that underpin AI development, but also the narratives that underpin AI development. That includes the different groups that exist within AI. So we have groups that are more optimistic and they're very deterministic about technology, more focused on the economic benefit of technology. And then we have the doomers who are concerned about existential crisis. And then we have the third group, which the first 2 groups think that they all belong to, which is the realists. And those are the people, who know that we're looking at AI optimistically, but also knowing that there are harms and sort of risks that are involved with that, and that you should approach them and not anticipating, so to say, like these fictional kinds of harms, but approaching real life harms. And the second area is building technology and products, so building new technologies and products that resemble this trustworthy AI. So what does trustworthy technologies look like? Mozilla has been investing in organizations like Llama AI. There's a Common Voice project. And also this urge to put more open source technologies out there, so data sets and so forth. The third one is just raising consumer awareness. Justin spoke about this thing of pushing literacy on a problem that is not really a literate problem, and how Mozilla approaches that is one through it's not literacy, so to say, it's just painting the picture for the consumer. So, for instance, there's the privacy not included project that identifies like different products and tells you, okay, your data is protected, or they're stealing your data, and da da da. So it's just informing people or consumers of what is happening. But I think on this third issue for Africa, we have a different kind of consumer issue, which is tied to policy prioritizations and the kind of solutions that we are offered on the continent. So it's kind of like they bring these solutions and then create problem. So it's awareness of like, hey, in South Africa, you can't say that you want to build a data center or cloud center or whatever, but I don't have electricity in my house. So, how do you balance that? Or like saying that technology or AI can solve poverty, why are you pumping money into there when you can just solve my poverty directly? The last one is strengthening AI regulations and incentives. This is primarily also where I work. And this comes from the, there's policymakers have been, responding to this development, but the technology is also, changing and developing fast, and funders which come from big tech even faster because they're investing in pushing regulations that allow them to have their, they serve their interests. But there is not enough voices from the African stakeholders themselves. So we're looking at, one, community building, mobilizing, certain CSOs and certain players, and just, incentivizing them or encouraging them to kind of, participate in this AI regulation. And also tied to the narratives part is painting this picture of what is AI versus innovation. I think historically, every time my parents have worked in government and they've worked in development, and every time someone talks about AI and innovation and regulation, the response is always like, but you're going to chase away the funders. They're anyways not coming. And when they do come, they're not funding the problems that are essential, like to the real problems. For instance, gender-based violence because of algorithms, or like information disorder, or not, at least not approaching it in the way that is meaningful. And so, incentivizing, like just, community building and so forth. And then the other one is, just go back to the innovation, the point I was trying to make between innovation and regulation. So people usually respond that if you regulate, you're either stifling innovation or you're pushing away funding. And I think we should look at it in a different way, that in order to innovate, we should be able to have this enabling environment, first of all, but also protect the people, consumers from the harm. So it's a safe environment in which all of this innovation can take place, rather than saying that these are blockades, that you cannot come and innovate and so forth. And just lastly, just the programs that, and I mentioned some of them that Mozilla works on, specifically the African Marivate program. Marivate means program in Swahili. It's the Common Voice Project, which is open voice, collecting open voice data sets with African languages. I think they've worked with Llama AI. In Real Life Fund, which is looking at partnering with, instead of like bringing solutions to different African continents. So looking at people who are approaching problems within the African, within different African countries, and solving real life problems, not problems that have been, dreamed up, so that technology can be applied to it. So real life problems. And then there is the Creative Media Awards, which is bringing together art and technology, but with the intention of communicating the kinds of like technological harms that we often talk about. So just allowing people to understand it through different ways, rather than just very long documents. And then there's the Responsible Computing Challenge, which is focused on curriculums within universities, for bringing, training computer scientists to be able to understand the politics. So that program is in Kenya. It's now being expanded to South Africa and as well as Ghana. And lastly, there are fellowships, so senior fellowships, like the one that I am, one of the projects that I'm doing. And so it's supporting people who are already working in this field, people who have had careers in certain areas and topics, to support them in whatever projects that they are implementing.
Great. Yeah, so thank you so much for that overview. So now we're going to go into questions that we have for the panelists today. And the first one is, AI deployment across the continent could lead to tremendous economic growth. Would AI become a significant driver of economic growth in Africa? What are the applications for the technology in facilitating economic development in key countries that we aren't talking about, but should be? And this, anyone can. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks. I think I think it's a complement as opposed to just being it's AI driven. So like I'll give examples in thinking about kind of geo AI, right? So you have growth in population, you have national statistics offices that are uneven. So depending on what country you're in, you might not have the same kind of capability. But now you've got geo AI, even though again surveillance. You then think about you can then count structures much better and then provide information to governments to actually help, properly distribute resources, right? So that's a place where you're seeing that there's a need then for the statistics offices to start bringing in more capability to harness such technologies, right? I'm not saying replace statisticians. I'm saying they actually have to be part of this because they are the only ones who really can help us count better. It's not the AI researchers who are necessarily going to be the ones who do it, right? Yeah, and that's the part sometimes the nuance is lost. That it's not that you're saying you replace it; it's just that they need this kind of work, and that those are the places that, just as an example, yes, I'll be selfish and say language can be an infrastructure for the continent to unlock many things, and as such, getting new kind of frameworks and tools to people that they can really communicate across the continent in people's languages will be something that changes, many people's lives. And that again is not even an AI thing. We have to have language teachers, language specialists, linguists in these spaces so that these can actually be built the correct way. So it's turning it around again that the AI can just be one of the enablers, but there has to be all this other infrastructure that's built with it.
Well, there we go. Just building on that. So, I mean, we're already seeing this deployed at scale in places like Dar es Salaam. The IMF, the World Bank, and others are using visual kind of geo kind of analysis, not just to do kind of image recognition, but to replan many of our cities around issues like flooding, extreme heat. So, I mean, the real existential kind of crisis facing a big chunk of Africa. If you look at where most Africans live, in West Africa specifically, it's a very narrow green strip along the southern kind of ocean boundary, and there's just desert to the north. That entire strip is going to be hit by extreme heat, by wet bulb moments, where people cannot survive without air conditioning, which is going to trigger 500 million people moving north or moving kind of into Central Africa. And so it's using these technologies to firstly do predictive modeling, and secondly, then start reimagining the infrastructure that we need. And that creates both upstream and downstream kind of knowledge economies. And most of that is being led by AI centers out of Google, out of West Africa, IBM out of kind of East Africa, and then large infrastructure partners who are like basically surfacing the problems. The issue here is that very few African institutions are part of any of that I've just mentioned. And we need to get to a place where there's joint implementation and shadowing to start from, so that we can start identifying the priorities that we care about that need to be addressed, rather than a global infrastructure kind of mega bank of sorts that is just interested in kind of where it can fund the next kind of road or dam. We're not seeing enough of that happening because the people aren't at the table. They're not understanding what the possibilities are. There's almost too much fear-mongering around kind of the social harms. And then on the flip side, there's too much hype around the startup culture. We're not looking at this intermediate level about where we could be building entire enabling infrastructures. My 2 cents.
Anyone else? All right, so we'll go to the next question. And so many African cities are burgeoning tech hubs. How can we support the growth of a strong ecosystem for innovation on the continent? What pieces need to be put into place to ensure that African countries are leading in building the AI innovations of tomorrow?
Thank you. So I believe that we have this thing of so many startups on the continent that just end in the valley of death. They don't move to the marketplace because the idea of startups is being treated like a science project. Like you just think, oh, technology can do this, and then you get up and then you build one. We need to rethink how we do this to have impact, which is identifying our problems and then finding the solution. Currently, it's just so many happy young people experimenting with technologies. And that's why it gets to a point and then everything just goes down over and over again. But if you have the main problems that we have as a continent on the table, and then we look at how to address them using innovation and emerging technologies, I believe we'll be able to cross over that valley of death situation and get most of these startups out of that into, making good impact on the continent. And then another thing that drives these situations is the source of the funding. So it comes with its own, even at the level of the African Union, some of our projects are driven by external funders and what they want. And because we don't have internal funding mechanisms to support the work that we do. So we sort of implement whatever the funder wants. And that then doesn't address the situations on the ground. And that's why you have projects that start, and then once the funder loses interest, it goes down, and then we are back to square one. I think that's what we are trying to look at when it comes to developing the continental strategy, to look at how to reframe some of these things. There was a time, for instance, in some countries in Africa that I can't mention, where there was just an increase in buying data centers, building data centers funded by external parties. So many of the institutions just went and purchased data centers, no technical know-how, no need for it per se. And they're just empty setups that are not being utilized because it was just a buzz and everyone was excited about it. So looking at how to strategize around that to ensure that whether it's an infrastructure recommendation or a technology recommendation, it's actually being targeted at addressing a particular problem on the continent would help address some of these issues that we have.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara.
Just on that, I think one of the solution or the problems that the responsible computing challenge that Mozilla is trying to solve is the skills, but not only the technical skills, but also the social skills, and the separation that has happened between these hard tech subjects or science subjects and the more creative, which I needed to drive products into the market. Aesthetics are important. Font types are important. All these beautiful things that make products shiny are important, but those are often outside of these discussions. So it's discussions of like hard science. But another thing is perhaps there is no field to test out and play, and that's where government comes in having sandboxes, testing out, how do certain regulations play out, or how do they affect people, but how do they affect startups, and how are they allowed to scale up? Instead of just speculating that this is what will happen or this or not happen. The other one is perhaps increasing participation, and I know people do not like talk. Some people, at least I think on the continent, we don't like talk about participation. But I think participation has been given bad PR, and but it's more meaningful. Participation does not only relate to like being at the table. It can also include the skills that people have to be able to think about problems. So diversifying skills, participating in terms of like business development skills in a different way, participating. Seeing funders as participants in these processes, and therefore identifying the different roles that are needed to improve the ecosystem. So I think participation, we should look at it more critically to diverse, to really see it as a relevant solution to expanding innovation in Africa.
Yeah. So. Obviously, I have a bias here because I'm one of the founders of a startup. But the thing that's important, like if I think about the journey of Llama AI, on one part is that we saw that we were able to build up this network and build really people working on AI at R&D at the edge of really giving us new knowledge. But the problem is that they then don't have places to go after they get all of these skills. Why? A lot of the big organizations on the continent and even the big tech companies do not have any engineering presence on the African continent, in 54 countries. So they are not there to build or have any real interactions when it comes to the core technologies that they're working on. It's mostly to reconfigure and sell forward. So what then happens is that we really at a huge risk that we are almost at like more neo-colonial transfer, that people build up skills on the African continent, they get up to the skilling, and then they have to move to Europe or North America, right? And there's a lot of people who are very happy about that. As I said, like it's 1 in 4 people in the globe is going to be African in 2050. So if you're thinking about the growth of economies, you're actually thinking about how you're going to bring in people who are coming from locations that have a higher birth rates, right? Because you won't be able to sustain the growth that is required without having that and the skills that come with that. So that's a thing that we have. And Belapa actually means home in Setswana. So we are trying to create this new place that can become a home for many AI researchers on the continent to come and really work on some of the most wicked problems, but then come up with very interesting innovations in that space. The other one is on the other side of the spectrum. For 54 countries means it's completely different depending on what country you're in. And in some places, it's really about building livelihood, the participation that you can be part of the economy and using the skills that you have to actually drive, even if it's a small enterprise that allows you to just have the livelihood that you have. For me, one of the most inspiring things I've been part of is having really the privilege to go around the continent thinking about AI. Sure, I still have to work on my algorithms, but really being in the spaces where you can sit on the floor with some people and then they tell you how they're trying to work out or work on a problem, and then getting to understand how it solves a real problem, like not something that's like a real problem. So I know if I'm in Nairobi, I'm talking to a lot of developers there. It's very different than if I'm talking to somebody who's in Lagos. It's very different to somebody like I'm in Freetown. And learning that has been really, for me, one of the best things about the last 10 years of my life. It's just, you sit there, you see how people are trying to get things and saying like, I need this because if I can enable this, there's these other parts of my tech stack that allows people to actually do what they need. And it's very different from I've spent time here in the Bay Area, very different to the way that people kind of think about problems. And I think that's the opportunity of why, for me, I would want the startups, because they need to try the things. The private industry on the continent is not going to do it. The public sector at the moment has too many challenges that they're looking at. Where it's going to be is in these spaces where you get young people to run with ideas, try things with good regulation and policies, though we have to protect people. But then through that, we come up with these new ways of thinking that we couldn't have come up with before.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to go into the topic about regulation. And so the potential for AI growth leads some to question whether or not this is the right time to be thinking about regulation. Do we think that the stifling of innovation is a primary concern, or does it risk us missing an opportunity to get regulation right at the onset of industry? I know, Kiito, you just talked about this a little bit, so if you'd like to start, that'd be great.
Yeah, how to expand more on it, but maybe just to add to what I've said, this contention between innovation and regulation, I think is something that is not incidental. I think it's something that has been weaponized by certain companies to draw away attention from the real issue. So, it's a discourse. I think it's not even only unique to the tech industry. It's in many other industries where certain corporations just do not want certain areas to be regulated because it inhibits them from, building products, testing products. So certain regions become a testing ground for certain technologies and it benefits them so that they can, kind of roll them out somewhere else where there are regulations. But there's also a threat of, we are going to pull out if you do not, if you regulate. So it's that power dynamic and not, like approaching the problem. The problem is there's a power disparity, and some people are weaponizing their power to kind of influence what people prioritize, what policymakers prioritize. I mean, I think we spoke during lunch is about this, that institutions like Meta, they have been investing in infrastructure in the continent. So maybe now policymakers in Africa have actually, the power to say that, hey, if you don't, abide to our regulations, leave. Will they leave because they've already invested? So I think there is, there's more leeway and more leverage that policymakers have. Justin wants to say something urgently.
Not urgently. Maybe a slightly different kind of view on it. And I think that we shouldn't look at this purely in kind of an African sense, or even in an AI sense. So even if you look here in California at the moment, there's, what's this thing, the California News Preservation Act or something that is being pushed through at the moment to try and protect a dinosaur industry that I used to work in, the media. And the media were the old school platforms, and now they're kind of getting cannibalized by the new platforms. And so California is trying to legislate protection, even calling it a Preservation Act. And this is after Google and Meta and various others have pulled out of very lucrative markets like Canada and Australia to make a point. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that I think even though we think that there's a sunk cost in Africa, they're concerned about creating a precedent that is going to be a domino effect. And I think that we need to be savvy about how we make those ultimatums. Otherwise, they will walk away, which is not necessarily always a bad thing. But we need to understand that kind of the power dynamic or kind of imbalance you're talking about is very real. And it's not just in Africa. We're seeing it play out here in kind of an economy that could be an entire country in California. So I think that was the one thing. The second thing, though, is that what we do in my work is we look to you guys, the Europeans, and we lean very heavily on what was the GDPR and the DSA, and now it's going to be an AI Act. And we use that in Africa to hold these same organizations accountable in ways that they don't care about African law. They're terrified of being squeezed out of the European marketplace. And so that's the leverage, that's the lever that we need to understand. Our markets are tiny. They don't care. And even if they do care about that small markets, they understand that creating a precedent is going to impact on far bigger markets. And so I think a lot of what we need to be doing is understanding where the real kind of fear is. And then we need to be creating collaborative partnerships with organizations like ourselves in these markets that have real teeth. And firstly, learning about how you guys got ahead of the curve, ahead of North America and everyone else, but also in terms of how you keep that balance where it also doesn't harm business, so we don't play into the trope that over-regulating is going to kill innovation. It's not to say Europe gets everything right. I mean, I can't live in Europe. I live on the fringe of Europe because it's a fortress Europe. They don't let people like us in. So there are things we need to redress there as well, but we need to learn about where there have been proven successes. Because otherwise it's just rhetoric, I think.
Barbara, I think are you going to speak?
Yeah, maybe just to build up on Justin's point, with the African Union, we have what we call the EU Innovation Agenda, where we are sort of trying to understand innovation from a co-evolutionary principle, where we are looking at regulations from other, maybe older democracies, but also ensuring that technologies serve our needs and address our challenges as a continent. So we are trying to find that balance. Within the EU Innovation Agenda, we've had discussions on some of these regulations at the EU level and how they apply to the continental strategies that we are developing at the African Union level to try and find that effective balance, because perhaps, like you mentioned, maybe ultimatums that we may would have more impact on us than if the AI give an ultimatum. So we need to weigh, that kind of situation and ensure that at the end of the day, the African populace is served with the regulation, they are protected, but also the technology serves its purpose as well.
Thank you. And so we're going to go into another question, talking about access to high-speed internet and advanced technology and how this could be potentially widening the digital divide. And so do you believe that it's possible, or if there are any ways that AI policy can foster an environment where the technological advancements do not widen the digital divide? Are there any examples of initiatives or policies that you've seen that have successfully mitigated these disparities?
I think
anyone can go.
I'm guessing it will border, especially on language, when it comes to the digital divide. There's that concern with the AI tools that the biases that are created in that increasing sort of that margin. And that's why there's a huge push towards the LLMs and making sure that the African populace is adequately reflected in some of these innovations and emerging technologies as well. So maybe in terms of what has worked, I would say the work that Vukosi is doing currently and other initiatives in that space that are sort of catching us up as a continent. So,
yeah, I think maybe I'll twist it a bit here in thinking about on one part, if we think about artificial intelligence, teaching and everything, one of the things that was very interesting, having supervised students across the continent, was learning that a lot of what we think about like AI teaching, right, is actually very English and Anglo, that you don't get even textbooks in French. So for a lot of Francophone Africa, they have to switch, that you do your undergrad in maths or computer science, but then once you have to get to do your graduate school, you have to switch to English. And this is a challenge. So I'm not even getting yet to the 2,000 languages on the continent. All right. So now it becomes this part of actually you see this kind of gaps in the way there's availability of knowledge. And when we look at local African languages and developing them, you then see these major gaps in how countries like, Ghana, for example, will say they only have one official language, which is English, which doesn't make any sense. If you're in Ghana, there's all these, it's just a kind of a loophole that gets the government to just say we only develop our material in English, but that's not the reality. So when COVID happened, a lot of scholars actually crowdsourced recording themselves speaking in Twi, in Ga, in all these languages in Ghana because the government wasn't officially responding. Right. So what it is that if you can get the parts of AI to work very well in these languages, you will fill in gaps that people do not think about in this room. Right. Because people then can have communication that becomes very useful. We work with teachers who are thinking about, how do we make sure we can teach basic maths in some of these languages? Because we know from the from the literature, it's bad if you're not teaching people in their mother tongue, it's much harder for them to grasp these concepts and it takes longer. So how do we make sure that those things become available? It means that we have to have lots more investment in the research, in the core research that allows us to build these things. There's another researcher who's from the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, I think it might be in the Ghana or Rwanda thing. And he was going back home, I think in Mauritania, and building up and teaching stats in his home language. And now we were having a chat about a month ago, and I was like, this is actually great, because on the AI side, if we can start getting more and more of these texts, we can then start building up more and more models that can build, can do translation in math in these languages. And maybe now we actually are in a good position that we can scale this. Maybe we can do 40 African languages all at once and then see how well that works. But these are the things that if we don't fill them, right, they just quickly, all of a sudden, it's, we don't understand why we're having such a major challenge in these spaces. And it becomes so expensive to fix it that people just let it be and say no, let's rather the gap just exist. But the impact that it has is multi-generational.
Justin, I think I saw a reaction from you. Did you want to speak to this? Okay, great, awesome. So before we transition into the,
Okay. I'm just reminded of a project that Alison worked on the After Access project. So I think that's also the point that he was making. In people thinking about the digital divide, they only think about the people who don't have access to, but then they don't think about what are the challenges that people who have access face. So he mentioned one, being that you may study maths and then you have to switch from French to English. So those kind of challenges and looking at the after access challenges that populations or communities face are so important to look at rather than just the access part of it.
Thank you. So before we transition into the Q&A, I just want to ask all the panelists, what do you believe is missing most from the conversation about what's happening on the African continent about AI?
Africans?
Great answer.
I would say African women as well, and just and feminist principles and people who have. I think this is a huge elephant in many rooms that we talk about human rights-based technologies, but many populations or people in the African continent do not have rights. So which human rights are you protecting if, certain groups do not have rights? I think that's one of the things that need spoken about more. Yeah.
I think it's not public interest. I mean, the research that came out now from the study that everyone's referred to this morning shows that behind India, Kenyans were the most aware globally of kind of just ChatGPT, that they use it in a far higher kind of degree than people in the global north already as co-piloting in their jobs and kind of in school. They're probably using it to cheat or whatever, but there's a mass adoption. So I think that there is interest and there is Africans have been early adopters, often because there's nothing else. So people leapfrog. And so I think that, the things that are missing is, I think, firstly, a real understanding amongst policymakers that the cat's out of the bag. People are using this stuff at scale. But then the second thing is that I think that we haven't really thought about how we scale things. So how do we scale your startup? There's not kind of the funding or the other kind of support mechanisms that you see in here in Silicon Valley. And obviously, we don't want to necessarily peg ourselves on that, but in most other places as well, for letting people or helping people understand the market and then helping them actually get to that market. My favorite story is we've got a big office in Nigeria, and I stay with kind of colleagues when I stay at their house. And eventually I said to the couple that host me most often, you guys really don't have to speak English to each other all the time just because I'm here and I don't speak any Nigerian. It's like, no, we come from different parts of Nigeria. We don't understand each other. English is the only language that we actually have in common. And I think that language thing is a massive issue, but it translates to also the fragmented markets that we're dealing with in Africa. If you look at just the language thing as a symptom of kind of these little filter bubbles that people live in, we haven't really kind of figured out how to scale, not even AI, anything else continental. And so I think we need to be thinking about those delivery mechanisms. Yeah.
Great. Barbara, anything?
I think all has been said. Maybe bringing in African governments more. I am still getting lots of pushback when we engage them, so I hope they come to the table soon.
That'd be great. Awesome. So please give a round of applause for our panelists. I'd like to have the opportunity, if anyone has any questions in the audience, to raise their hand. I think someone should come around with a microphone.
Thank you. I was hesitant to take the floor again, but there's just so much coming from this excellent panel. Two questions. One, why are companies not seeing more opportunity on the continent to actually engage people in more diverse ways than just putting these hubs, here and there? It would seem that just the consumer base and the growth potential is enormous, and it just doesn't seem to be a driver. So if you can reflect on that. The other is the tension that you started with, Justin, between, repressive tendencies on the parts of governments. On the other hand, the lack of rights protections that people have. What might be local incentives to get a rights-based approach to policy? How can that be fostered? How can that be organized? Are there cultural anchors that might work powerfully? Can the African Union do anything, or is that really complicated because of the many members? Where are those incentives?
Second part, colleagues, Barbara, but I mean, from what I've seen at a kind of expert level, is the AU, Africa is almost too complex, but the regional groupings are far more effective. And what we almost need to do in the same way that we look to European kind of regulatory environments, we need to start figuring out some of these transnational kind of solutions, because they can hold in check someone who goes bad, a government that kind of suddenly becomes a junta, or that slides into ethnic cleansing and genocide like Ethiopia did. So I think there needs to be more kind of regional integration and more regional approaches. It's difficult, it's slow, it's complex, it's incredibly fragile. But I think that seems to work. And increasingly, we're seeing regional economies and integration. And so that economic glue might be, kind of a way of getting some of this stuff sticking. What was the first part of your question? So I mean, my sense, again, just from those that we deal with, is that the profits are still exploiting low Africa labor costs and the input costs. Even the running of the data centers, we had very cheap electricity until South Africa broke it. But it's still the costs of kind of the profit margin is bigger to leverage that and sell to a dollarized or a EU market than try and run around and try and make a profit in shillings in this very fragmented space. You might have a different sense to me.
Like I was going to say, it's the same. It's just squeezing profits out. So even like when you're not talking about big multinationals, but you're talking about big African corporations, for them, it's almost like the R&D is done somewhere else, not on the continent. So we just benefit from it, which means you're actually subsidizing even Silicon Valley, right? Because if you're buying things only from here, you're not actually developing local R&D, then you're just shifting where it happens. So it's also it becomes a chicken and egg thing where you can sit with executives and they'll say, well, it's great if I buy something from North America or Europe, it looks like it's already completely done. While if it's on the African continent, it will take a few more cycles. But there has to be this understanding that it's actually an investment that's not a cost, right? So if we're just squeezing profits out of, or it's just the shareholder at the end of the day, then we're not really going to direct our future, right? We are not going to direct our destiny. We will always just be beholden to whoever then says, this is how we're going to do it. Yeah.
There are exceptions. I mean, there's some African companies that try and operate at a global scale. So, I mean, if you look at, and invariably they'll take that understanding of a dysfunctional physical environment and they'll clone it onto China or onto an India or even a Russia and apply their approaches, and they tend to do well in those markets. So the one that always gets cited here at Stanford is Naspers, and it's investments into Tencent in China, and then how they've rolled that, and they're now getting into AI. But they're offshore, and suddenly they're all based out of the Netherlands or wherever. They actually then, again, they move north, and they just use Africa for their cheap labor, intellectual labor.
We have another question in the front.
Thank you. I suppose there's a number of questions that are bundled. I'll try and keep it short because I have spoken before. Many of the opening sentences or many of the questions sort of spoke about, AI and economic growth and AI and innovation and, Africa and, development and those sorts of things. But in fact, what characterizes the continent when we look at it at the moment in terms of AI is, profound digital inequality, data injustice, labor extraction. I mean, we've only been speaking about the AI kind of high end, but, mineral extraction, very exploitative labor, content regulation, highly dramatic and very cheaply paid, etc. So, when we look at these policies, they all start of that. The AI, AU policies, the South African policies, and everybody's, heading towards these blueprints. And I'm just sort of wanting us to talk about, what do we need to do systemically? Because there's been talk, I think the work that Vukosi does is absolutely extraordinary. And I think language is really one of the catalyzing things that we can do so much for. But in terms of the policies that we've got, that are being proposed currently, are they even able to add sufficient guardrails, firstly? And then, as I was saying this morning, is that actually sufficient? What are we doing to actually ensure that we harness those economic opportunities for Africans? And I don't think that's very active in the policy. There's acknowledgement of the digital inequality, and then it's moving right along. As I said, just like the Global Digital Compact, all of these, nobody's actually saying, what are we going to do differently to get different outcomes? Because we can't carry on doing the same thing and expect different outcomes. What are we going to do to actually ensure data injustice? And on that score, Barbara, I was wondering if you could speak. You've spoken about the challenges of coordination, but we've got a African data policy framework that speaks to data justice, that speaks to redressing some of these problems, principled agreement from 53 member states. And yet it's barely referenced, in the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's not mentioned at all. In fact, it counters it. It's not mentioned in the data policy frameworks. The AU and NEPAD's documents don't even talk to each other. So, is this not the way that we could deal with some of these systemic things? And I just want to just tag on that, the issue of, the challenges of repressive states using coherently framed AI things. I mean, I think we've had this a lot in multilateral forums where countries have said, we don't want UNESCO's platform guidance because repressive governments will use that to pretend that it's misinformation or whatever it is. But if we don't have those frameworks in place, in those vacuums, other things happen. And I don't think Chinese investment is the worst thing that happened on the continent at all. But what has gone with that investment around biometrics schemes is the social merit system on top. So that comes as part of the package. And according to a panel that I was recently on, GIZ, there are 13 African countries that are applying that metric thing, from Ethiopia to etc. So if we don't do that, if we don't set up those normative frameworks, that civil society can mobilize, so the people who signed up to these conventions or guidelines or UN principles can actually be pushed to those. We can't just we can't just step back from that because they're going to be misused.
Yeah, I could answer. So on the right-based approaches, so I know that I think when I arrived 2 days ago, I saw a paper from our human rights division where they are thinking of developing some policy documents on this at the African Union level. I think they're releasing it for public comments next month. Framing some of those discussions when it comes to human rights and their approaches related to AI. But maybe linking it to Alison's comment is the fact that the way policies are developed at the continental level, it's very fragmented, and that's why you don't have them talking to each other. I think AI creates that opportunity for us to begin to talk to each other, recognizing the fact that it's not an isolated technology that can be rolled out by one unit or one section, and there's the need for that intersection. Currently, there are initiatives around digitalization, for instance, that brings together the various, like the data governance frameworks, some of the continental strategies that have been released. And what we are early thinking is to use the REC approach, the regional economic communities, because it's usually more impactful at that level and more binding on countries. So they're able to sit and have some systematic changes at that level, rather than using the African Union approach that doesn't really have binding regulations. It's just recommendations we make at the end of the day. So this is early thinking on how we can roll out some of these things to actually see systematic change, especially with our governance services and how AI can transform governance at national levels, practically on the continent. That's as much as my pay grade will allow me to talk about, but hopefully we'll see some change here.
So we're at time. So I'm going to again thank our panelists for their time today. And